People who hired a private investigator? What did you find out? I used to work for an insurance defense firm years ago. The best story I have is where we hired a PI to tail a guy who was suing our client for an injury that wasn't entirely our client's fault. The guy was refusing to settle and was insisting on going to trial, even though we offered a fair sum that would have paid his medical bills. The PI we hired got some good pictures that showed the plaintiff was nowhere near as injured as he claimed, but the crown jewel was one photo where the guy was walking on a pier with a woman who wasn't his wife. He had his hand on her ass and everything. Later in a deposition, the attorney slid the picture to the plaintiff and said something like, "Mr. Smith, who's the woman in this picture? We would like to schedule a deposition with her as well." The guy went white as a ghost and told his attorney he wanted to settle. At least he was smart enough to realize that if his wife found out about the other woman, he was going to have to get a family law attorney as well, because the divorce papers would soon follow. When I met my wife, she seemed to have a normal, modern family. 2 moms and 2 dads. Over time, it became apparent that her stepdad wasn't around much. He'd just pop in to say hi, then take off again. My wife's family thought this was normal, just the way it had always been since they were teenagers. He claimed to have a job following FedEx trucks around the state to prevent theft and drug trafficking. I thought it strange and started making jokes about him having another family. Well, I guess it got my sister-in-law thinking because she asked a favor from the PI at her law firm. Sure enough, he has not just 2, but 3 wives around the state and 5 other stepchildren between them. My sister-in-law breaks the news to her mother, who immediately changes the locks and files for divorce. They never speak again. Divorce is even uncontested. As an FU, they also send the PI's report to his other wives. I hired a PI during a custody battle. My child's father had been given supervised visitation only, and the supervisors were supposed to be his parents. As the visits went on, I started getting concerned about whether the supervision was actually happening. Things like running into his parents at the grocery store while they were supposed to be at the visit, sending my infant son to a 5-hour visit, and getting him back in the same marked diaper I sent him in, etc. Enter the PI. Over the course of a few weeks, he found out that the parents were not always staying around to supervise the visitation like they were supposed to. That wasn't unexpected, given my suspicions. What was unexpected was that he found out that my child's father was shacking up with some gal in a trailer park who had 2 children of her own and an alligator living in the bathtub of the only bathroom in her trailer. That was fun to talk about in court. My girlfriend's mother wanted to find an old British boyfriend of hers when she was young. This was before Facebook, so we hired a private detective. The PI was able to track him down through one of the man's daughters. When she tried to contact him, he was elusive and suspicious. He didn't believe my girlfriend's mom at first. When they finally met, he explained that he received a lot of harassment for his beliefs. Turns out, he was a Holocaust denier and actually wrote a book about that. The conclusion of my girlfriend's mother was that sometimes it is better to leave things in the past. I hired a PI to do a complete background check on my sister's then-boyfriend. He'd been a drug-addicted liar when she first dated him 20 years before, and I didn't believe him when he said he'd cleaned up his act. He claimed to be a successful businessman, as well as clean and sober for the past 2 decades. I asked my sister if she wanted me to do this, and she said yes. She was sure he had changed, and she wanted to prove me wrong. Nope. He had several DUIs, and he'd only gotten out of jail a few months prior. He had multiple stints in jail for credit card fraud and no consistent employment for years, just low-skilled jobs he only kept for a few months at a time. I showed this all to my sister. She married him anyway. She then acted all surprised when he refused to get a job, drank all day, and started beating her. Less than 2 years later, I helped pay for her divorce. The background check turned out to be a waste of money, not because it failed to reveal the truth, but because the truth wasn't what my sister wanted to hear. I grew up on a close-knit council estate in the UK. A woman who was close friends with my mother suspected her husband was cheating on her and hired a PI. After a week or so of following her husband, the PI discovered that he was indeed cheating on her with my dad. My father was always a huge homophobe, so it was just delightful watching him squirm until he admitted the affair. My mother used a PI so many times when I was a kid, even I was on a first-name basis with him. Tony was someone my grandfather used a lot for labor-related issues. The NLRB had no balls in the 80s, so he came cheap as a favor. The first few times were my dad, who had made a hobby out of dodging child support. We weren't hurting, and he always paid in the end, but a weekend in jail cured him of even trying. Next was a peeping Tom. We tried police, cameras, sensor lights, you name it. Tony had him in 2 hours based on old police reports. It turned out to be a guy down the street who was about 12 mentally and just liked watching other people because he had no friends. Adult Protective Services got him into a program, he got a friend, and voila, no more peeping Tom. Then there were all the times Mom used him when she worked for a women's shelter. Tony would drop by just after I got out of school with an envelope of documents to say, "Tell your ma the a-hole moved his mistress in," or "So-and-so is banking at Wells Fargo now and just used his wife's credit to buy a Lincoln," and I'd pay him with cash my mother had stuck to the side of the fridge with a magnet. Knowing Tony as a kid has forever ruined my image of PIs in fiction. They're all manly, broad-shouldered womanizers with a rough past and alcoholism like Mike Hammer or Thomas Magnum. Not Tony. He was a tiny gay Mexican who didn't drink and wouldn't work Sunday morning because he had to take his mother to church. If you enjoy this video, please give it a thumbs up and subscribe to my channel. Thank you. I didn't hire one, but my parents did. I was 14 and met another teen online. My parents knew if they forbade me to talk to him, I would rebel big time. So they hired a PI who sat me down to tell me it was actually a 40-year-old man who had been grooming me and was trying to lure me to his state. I'm forever thankful they did that. Seriously, I can't say it enough. Parents, please monitor your kids' online friendships. My dad hired a private investigator after my uncle was murdered. I was 15 at the time. It turned out that my uncle owed some money to some pretty shady people after developing a drug problem. Finding all this out at 15 was shocking, to say the least. They took my uncle, beat him to death, threw his body off a bridge into the Trinity River in West Dallas, and set his car on fire. The PI was able to find out who killed him, but there wasn't enough evidence to charge the guys who did it. The only thing that makes me feel better is that one of the guys who did it killed the other one and is now in prison for it. I used to work in a PI firm that specializes in insurance fraud. I write surveillance and background investigation reports that we passed along to our clients, mostly lawyers and insurance companies. One thing that never failed to surprise me is the astounding number of people who claim to suffer devastating disabilities, regularly post pictures and videos of themselves running marathons and building decks in their yards. In at least half of the cases I handled over 2 years, our clients flagged their claimants as fraudulent because of social media. Disgruntled exes are another significant source of tips. To give you an example in which social media saved a case, it's summer, and on the day of surveillance, our investigator sees the claimant and his family loading their car with beach stuff. The claimant drives for a couple of hours before the investigator eventually loses sight of the vehicle. The investigator, being way too far from his own home, checks into a motel. The next morning, he checks his phone and finds that the claimant checked in at a water park on Facebook. Investigator makes a pit stop to buy some swim trunks and a beach towel, drives to the water park, and gets hours of covert footage of the claimant swimming in a wave pool, going down water slides, picking up and putting down his kids, and generally doing a whole lot of things you shouldn't be able to do with a serious spine injury. If you're going to commit insurance fraud, stay the hell off of social media. My story is a little different. I had a PI investigate me. About 6 years ago, I became very ill with a variety of issues. I was an optician. Using my hands with arthritis was never going to be a plan, so I applied for disability support. This is in the UK. I sailed through and started receiving a monthly amount. Now fast forward a few years. I start getting restless at home, so I retrain into a job that doesn't involve my hands. I stop receiving money, except for the benefit you can get while you work. I use it to pay off an automatic car. Well, my very nasty mother's friend saw me start work and called the benefits office, assuming I was still claiming. Unfortunately, she exaggerated and told them I was living a normal life and even running daily. So the benefits office filmed and watched me. They thought they had an aha, gotcha moment. Their PI provided photos of me walking unaided. When I sat in the meeting with the smug fraud officers and my solicitor, I felt sick to my stomach. They were trying to make it look like I had been running and jogging, but I knew I never walked any further than 5 meters to my car. Anyway, my solicitor pointed out that the photos were screenshots of a video. We asked for the videos. The videos were of me struggling to walk. In one of them, I rest on my car before opening my door. In another, I was going into a supermarket and had replaced my cane with a trolley to lean on. You get the picture. The fraud team basically said, "Oops," and I never heard from them again. I didn't really find anything, merely confirmed that my now ex-wife was in fact sleeping with some dude from Facebook that she'd been chatting up for a few months. It's now 6 years later, and I have full physical custody of our 3 daughters, and none of my girls willingly spend more than a couple hours with her around the holidays. $1,500 for a DVD I've never watched. Best money I ever spent. We had a case 10 years back where we felt an employee was faking an injury. The PI got video footage of him getting freaky with his wife with the curtains open. The acts that were witnessed would have been impossible since he was claiming he could not even walk without assistance. At the next court hearing, we planned to show the video in hopes of getting the case dismissed. Yet when he arrived with his wife, it became evident that the woman in the video was not his wife. We asked for a brief recess, showed him and his attorney the video in private, and he walked back into the courtroom and dropped the lawsuit. I always wondered what he told his wife after that. I met an amazing woman at a convention. She was married, but that didn't stop us from spending the whole convention together in her bed. She said her husband has no sex drive, so even back home, she lives several states away from me, she cheated on him with 2 to 3 men every week. Anyway, the convention ends and we both go back home. 2 years later, we are both at the same convention again, but apparently I have somehow offended her in the meantime. So she called my boss to say that I had been inappropriate with her. I found out later that she was developing feelings for me, which I did not reciprocate, so she figured she would just keep me away from her and from damaging her marriage. Her little stunt got me fired. I waited a few days and hired a private investigator. She had told me previously about her favorite hotel for meeting her men, so I told my PI what to look out for. A few weeks later, he's got pictures, video, audio, names, addresses for all the men she's met there, as well as the dates, times, and room numbers. I just told him to send it all to her husband. She not only lost her job and her marriage, but most of the other men were married as well, so their wives all got the same info. When I explained the situation to my boss and gave him the evidence, I was reinstated. My grandmother's first boyfriend after my grandfather died said he was a retired cop and a veteran. They enjoyed dancing to country music together and bought a new car in her name, even though she can't drive anymore. My uncles had a hunch and hired a PI. Turns out, that old bastard had a habit of shacking up with widows and bleeding them dry. They let my grandmother know and she was heartbroken. My niece's dad married a very controlling woman. She ended up convincing him to take my sister to court for full custody of my niece, which ended up stressing my sister out so much that her water broke at 29 weeks. My parents hired a PI and found out that this woman was using food stamps to buy groceries instead of the money he was giving her, and that she was getting prescriptions from 12 different doctors. He ended up contacting his wife's parents, who he was told were already dead. After he introduced himself, her dad immediately asked how much she took from him. Turns out, he wasn't the first guy she had done this to. She also wasn't using her real name. He ended up divorcing her, and she's currently doing time in prison for fraud and a handful of other charges. This happened when I was in college. I slept with a girl at a party and went home. The next day, I got a call from the police because they were investigating an incident at said party. Turns out, this random girl claimed I raped her at the party. My whole future looked like it was gone and I was done for. But the truth is, she came on to me and asked me for sex. So my family hired a PI and he went to work. In just 2 weeks, he was able to find a pattern of this girl's overdrinking. That night, she got caught drinking again and told her parents that a bunch of guys held her down, forced her to drink, and then took advantage of her. My PI was able to get her on a phone call with her best friend, who knew what was actually going on, to admit that she made the whole thing up to avoid trouble at home by throwing me under the bus. Since he had it recorded, my lawyer submitted the tape to the police and they dropped the case instantly. The school was not happy that one of their students had gotten away with grape on campus, so they suspended me for sexual harassment under Title IX for 2 semesters. I did end up finishing college, but that was honestly the scariest time in my life. I didn't trust women for years and didn't date for what felt like an eternity. I am now happily engaged to a wonderful woman who loves me, and I cannot wait for our wedding next spring. To the best friend who was willing to get some guy she didn't know out of trouble for sleeping with her drunk friend, you are the real hero of the story. My mom's father walked out on their family when my mom was just 5. A few years later, her mother died of a grand mal seizure. Mom was taken in by her grandparents, but she always wondered why her dad left and what became of him. In her 40s, she hired a PI to track him down. Turns out he moved over time from Pittsburgh to California, where he wound up in prison for armed robbery and some other violent crimes. He died in San Quentin Penitentiary. I think my mom got a lot of closure out of that. She was able to see that life would have most likely been worse had he stayed. At least, living with her grandparents, she was loved and raised to fulfill her potential. I briefly worked for a PI when I was 19. Getting the job was a funny story itself. I was walking past the office, which is in a tiny strip mall smack in the middle of a residential neighborhood. On a whim, I decided to go in and see what a real PI's office looked like. Pretty unremarkable, except for the huge biker sitting at the only desk in a polo shirt and slacks. We got to chatting, and I asked if he was hiring. He laughed and asked me what kind of work I was expecting. I told him, probably a lot of boring work. He laughed again. He did that a lot. We even called him Santa because of that and his white beard, and gave me the job. I worked there for 3 months, during which we did a lot of insurance work. That consisted mostly of sitting in a car, reading a book, occasionally taking pictures of some guy in a neck brace or leg cast, and 2 or 3 times taking pictures of a guy playing baseball or basketball in his backyard. Santa also had a much reduced rate for tracking down biological family. We had one case where this woman in her 30s wanted to find her bio-mom. We went on our usual course, visiting courthouses, city halls, and libraries to track this woman down. We spent a whole month on it, which was a bit longer than usual, as the client didn't know her mother's name. Her adoptive parents had already passed away years ago. The client didn't have any of the adoption paperwork either, and didn't know where it would be filled. This was in the 90s, when not everything was digital. I finally found the adoption paperwork in a courthouse in the next county over and got a name. Santa didn't let me work overtime, so I went to drop off the copies of the paperwork at his office and go, but the guy stopped me before I could leave. He was all excited by the mother's name. It was his wife. Turns out his wife had given up a baby for adoption 30-something years ago. He called his wife, who dug up her copies of the paperwork from back when, and sure enough, it's a match. We called the client, who didn't answer, then went and picked up his wife and drove to the client's home. Santa and his wife immediately bear-hugged the client, who was very confused. Both were too emotional to get the words out, so I explained to the client that the woman was her bio-mom and the PI was her husband. It was such a beautiful scene. That memory is one of the things that's kept me from turning bitter over the years. Thank you for watching, and please subscribe to my channel for more Reddit stories. See you in the next video.